Chapter 3, Corruption Unveiled. Part 1, Alaric's Secrets. The arcane quarter was barely recognizable. The haze that had hung in the air earlier was now a visible shroud, twisting and curling like smoke. Shadows danced unnaturally across the cobblestones, stretching and shifting in ways that made Kai's skin crawl. The magical lanterns lining the streets flickered weakly, their steady glow reduced to faint, sputtering pulses. "This isn't just the depths leaking through," Soren muttered, scanning the street with her crossbow raised. "It's accelerating." "Accelerating how?" Kai asked, his voice low. Emberling padded beside him. Its fiery form casting small pockets of light that pushed back the encroaching darkness. Soren gestured to a twisted figure slumped against the wall of a nearby building. It looked human at first glance, but its limbs were unnaturally long, and its face was distorted, its features melted together, like wax left too close to a flame. "The corruption doesn't usually spread this fast," she said grimly. "Whatever Alaric did, it's tearing through the city like wildfire." Kai's stomach twisted. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was his fault, that the ritual he'd performed had set this nightmare in motion. But blaming himself wouldn't fix anything. "Alaric must have left something behind," he said. "Clues, journals, anything that could tell us what he was working on." Soren raised an eyebrow. "You think he'd leave breadcrumbs for you?" "I don't know," Kai admitted. "But he had to keep records. He was always writing in his journals." "Fine," Soren said with a shrug. "Lead the way." Mistvale Curiosities was as ruined as they'd left it, but the oppressive weight that had hung in the air the previous night was gone. The wards were shattered, the shelves splintered, and shards of enchanted glass littered the floor. Soren swept the shop with her crossbow as Kai moved toward the back room. Emberling followed, its flames flickering softly as it sniffed at the scattered debris. Kai stopped in front of the door to Alaric's private study. It was locked. Of course it was. But he knew the wards that guarded it. Alaric had always insisted on keeping the most sensitive parts of the shop sealed. "Can you get it open?" Soren asked, standing just behind him. Kai nodded, though his confidence wavered. He pressed his palm against the door's surface, muttering the counterspell Alaric had taught him years ago. The runes carved into the wood glowed faintly, then faded as the door clicked open. "Impressive," Soren said dryly. Kai ignored her, stepping into the study. The room was cramped, its walls lined with overflowing bookshelves and cluttered desks. Papers and journals were scattered everywhere, their pages covered in Alaric's precise, looping handwriting. Kai moved to the nearest desk, his fingers brushing over a stack of notes. The pages were filled with diagrams and equations he couldn't decipher, magical formulas far beyond his understanding. "Find anything useful?" Soren asked, leaning against the doorway. "Not yet," Kai said, flipping through the notes. "But there's a lot here." Soren didn't look convinced. If he knew the veil was weakening, he would have hidden the important stuff. "Look for something out of place." Kai frowned, scanning the room more carefully. His eyes landed on a large leather-bound journal lying open on the central desk. Unlike the scattered papers around it, the journal was pristine, its spine unbroken, its pages neatly filled. He picked it up, his hands trembling slightly as he turned to the most recent entry. The words on the page sent a chill down his spine. "The barrier was never meant to hold this long. The depths are growing restless. If the relic falls into the wrong hands, it could trigger a complete collapse. I can't let them find it. Not yet. The cost is too great." Kai's breath caught as he read the final lines. "Even if it means betraying him." "What does it say?" Soren asked, stepping closer. Kai closed the journal, his heart pounding. Alaric knew the barrier was failing. He knew what was happening, and he was hiding something. "A relic." Soren's expression darkened. "Where is it?" Kai shook his head. "I don't know. He doesn't say." Soren muttered a curse under her breath. "Of course he doesn't. That would have been too easy." Kai's grip tightened on the journal. "But he left this here. He wouldn't have kept it unless it was important." Soren glanced at the desk, her sharp eyes scanning the scattered papers. "If the relic's that powerful, it's not just Alaric who'll want it. The depths will send things to find it." Kai shuddered at the thought. Memories of the corrupted creatures flooding back. "Then we have to find it first." "Agreed," Soren said. "But we're not going to figure it out here. Take the journal. There's someone in the Undercity who might be able to help." Kai frowned. "We were just there." "Who are you talking about?" Soren smirked. "An informant. He deals in secrets, and for the right price, he'll give us what we need." Kai hesitated, glancing back at the journal. The cryptic notes Alaric had left were a riddle he couldn't solve alone. If Soren's contact could help them, it was their best chance. "Fine," he said, slipping the journal into his satchel. "Let's go." Soren nodded, already heading for the door. Emberling chirped softly, its fiery tail flicking as it followed them out into the haze-filled streets. Kai glanced back at the study one last time, unease twisting in his gut. What else was Alaric hiding? Chapter 3, Corruption Unveiled. Part 2, The Relics Trail. The Undercity felt different this time. The oppressive weight that had hung in the tunnels before was stronger now, pressing against Kai's chest with every step. The air was colder, the shadows darker, and the faint murmurs that had whispered at the edges of his mind had grown louder. Even Emberling seemed uneasy, its flickering body glowing a little brighter as it trotted beside him. "You sure this informant is still alive?" Kai asked, his voice echoing faintly in the passage. Soren didn't slow her pace. "If anyone can survive down here, it's him." Kai swallowed hard, his fingers brushing against the strap of his satchel. The weight of Alaric's journal felt heavier than it should, its presence a constant reminder of how little he understood. "What's his name?" Kai asked after a moment. Soren smirked. "You don't need to know his name. That's not ominous at all," Kai muttered. They turned a corner and entered a larger chamber, its walls lined with faintly glowing runes. The floor was scattered with debris, broken crates, discarded tools, and pieces of what might have once been furniture. Soren stopped abruptly, raising her hand in a silent signal for Kai to halt. "What is it?" he whispered. She didn't answer. Her eyes scanned the room, her crossbow raised and ready. Kai followed her gaze, his heart skipping a beat, when he saw the figure standing in the shadows at the far end of the chamber. The man was tall and thin, his face obscured by a tattered hood. His movements were slow and deliberate as he stepped into the dim light, revealing hands covered in blackened scars that pulsed faintly with a sickly green glow. Soren lowered her crossbow slightly. "Rydor." The man's hood tilted upward, revealing a gaunt, pale face etched with lines of exhaustion and something far darker. His eyes, sunken and shadowed, glimmered faintly with green light as he regarded them in silence. "Soren Draven," he said finally, his voice rasping like dry leaves. "I didn't think I'd see you again." "Lucky you," Soren said, her tone dry. "We need information." Rydor chuckled softly, the sound devoid of humor. "Of course you do. And what makes you think I have anything worth giving?" "You always do," Soren replied, "especially when it comes to Alaric." Rydor's expression darkened at the name. His eyes flicked to Kai, narrowing slightly. "And who's this?" "None of your concern," Soren said sharply. Kai bristled but held his tongue. He had a feeling arguing with Soren wasn't going to help. Rydor's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer before he turned. Back to Soren. "What do you want to know?" "Alaric was looking for something. A relic tied to the veil," Soren said. "We need to know where he went." Rydor was silent for a long moment, his scarred hands twitching at his sides. "If Alaric was chasing relics, then he was more desperate than I thought. And more foolish." "Where did he go?" Soren pressed. Rydor's lips curled into a thin smile. "There's an old shrine near the edge of the Undercity. Forgotten by most, but not by him. If he was looking for answers, he would have gone there." Kai's stomach twisted at the mention of another shrine. Memories of the last one, the glowing runes, the twisted creatures, flooded his mind, and he fought back a surge of unease. "What's at the shrine?" Soren asked. Rydor's smile faded. "Power," he said simply, "and death if you're not careful." Soren nodded, already turning to leave. But Rydor stepped forward, his voice sharp. "Draven." She stopped, glancing back. "Be careful," Rydor said, his tone low and serious. "If the corruption is as bad as I think it is, the shrine may not be the same as you remember. The depths are seeping into everything now, twisting what they touch. And if you let them, they'll twist you too." Soren's expression didn't waver. "I'll keep that in mind." She motioned for Kai to follow, and they left the chamber without another word. The path to the shrine was narrower than the tunnels they'd traveled before, forcing Kai to walk in single file behind Soren. The air grew colder with every step, and the faint whispers in his mind became sharper, more distinct. They weren't just noises anymore, they were words. "Kai," they murmured, soft and insistent, "come closer." He clenched his jaw, shaking his head as if the action could drive the whispers away. "You okay back there?" Soren asked, glancing over her shoulder. "I'm fine," Kai said quickly, though his voice was tight. "Good, because this is about to get worse." Kai frowned. "How can you possibly know that?" Soren didn't answer. She just nodded toward the end of the tunnel, where a faint, pulsing light spilled into the passage. The shrine was close. When they entered the cavern, Kai's breath caught. The shrine stood at the center of the space, its structure warped and uneven. The runes carved into its surface pulsed erratically, their light flickering between pale gold and sickly green. The air around it shimmered like heat waves, distorting the space. But it wasn't the shrine itself that froze Kai. In place, it was the figure standing before it. A man draped in dark, tattered robes knelt before the shrine, his head bowed. His hands rested on the stone, and his body was still, save for the faint rise and fall of his shoulders. "Alaric?" Kai whispered, taking an involuntary step forward. The figure turned slowly, his face hidden in shadow. "No," Soren said, her voice grim. "That's not him." The man rose to his feet, his movements unnaturally fluid. As he stepped into the light, Kai's heart sank. No, the corruption had already taken him. His eyes glowed with the same sickly green light as the runes, and dark veins snaked across his skin, pulsing faintly with each beat of his heart. His smile was hollow, stretched too wide. "Welcome," he said, his voice distorted and layered with something inhuman. "You're just in time." Chapter 3, Corruption Unveiled. Part 3, Twisted Mentor. The corrupted man stepped closer, his glowing eyes fixed on Kai with unnerving intensity. His movements were slow and deliberate, each step carrying the weight of something unnatural. "You've come far, little mage," the man said, his voice echoing unnaturally, layered with a guttural undertone. "But you don't belong here." Kai swallowed hard, his legs refusing to move. Emberling bristled at his feet, its fiery tail snapping with sharp bursts of heat. Soren stepped in front of him, her crossbow raised. "Back off," she said coldly, her finger hovering over the trigger. The corrupted man turned his glowing eyes toward Kai. "You can feel it? Can't you?" he said. "The depths calling to you. They know what you've done. They know what you are." Kai froze, the man's words cutting through his panic. "What are you talking about?" The man's smile twisted into something cruel. "You broke the veil. You opened the way. And now, you will be their herald." Kai's heart pounded. "No, that's not true." The man raised his hands and the tendrils surged toward Kai. Before they could reach him, Emberling leapt between them, its fiery body colliding with the dark tendrils in an explosion of heat and light. The tendrils recoiled, hissing as they retreated back into the stone. The corrupted man snarled, his hollow voice rising in fury. "Foolish creature, you cannot stop what's coming." Soren took advantage of the distraction, firing another bolt at the man's head. This time the bolt struck true, shattering the corrupted flesh and sending him staggering backward. But he didn't fall. Instead, his form began to shift, his body warping and elongating as the corruption consumed him. His limbs stretched unnaturally, and his face dissolved into a mass of writhing tendrils and glowing eyes. Kai felt bile rise in his throat. "What is he? Not a man anymore?" Soren said grimly. "Just another pawn of the depths." The creature roared, the sound shaking the cavern as it lunged toward them. "Get out of here!" Soren shouted, firing another bolt. Kai hesitated, his feet rooted to the spot. "I can't just leave you." "I'll be fine," she said through gritted teeth. "You need to stop that shrine before it fully opens." Her words jolted him into motion. He turned toward the shrine, its runes pulsing like a heartbeat. The air around it shimmered, and the faint outline of a doorway began to take shape in the center of the structure. "Kai." The whispers in his mind coalesced into a single voice, soft, familiar, and insidious. "You can't stop it." Kai shook his head, clutching his spellbook tightly as he approached the shrine. "Shut up," he muttered, flipping through the pages. The voice laughed, low and mocking. "You're too late. You've already failed." "No," Kai said, his voice rising. "Not this time." He found the spell he was looking for, a sealing incantation. Alaric had taught him years ago. It wasn't meant for something this powerful, but it was all he had. "Claudaire Nexus," Kai shouted, slamming his hands against the shrine's surface. The runes flared gold for a moment, resisting the corruption's influence, but the green light fought back, and cracks began to spread across the shrine's surface. "Kai!" Soren shouted. He turned just in time to see the creature lunge toward him. The impact never came. Emberling hurled itself at the corrupted creature, its fiery body colliding with the mass of tendrils and eyes. The explosion of light and heat filled the chamber, forcing Kai to shield his eyes. When the light faded, the creature was gone. Only a smoking scorch mark remained where it had stood. Emberling wavered, its flames flickering weakly as it limped back to Kai's side. "You did it," Kai whispered, crouching down to place a hand on the fox's head. Its body felt warm, but its flames were dimmer than before. Soren hurried to his side, her crossbow lowered. "The shrine? It's not sealed yet," Kai said, his voice strained. He turned back to the runes, pressing his hands against them again. This time, the whispers in his mind screamed in protest, their voices clawing at his thoughts. But he didn't stop. "Claudaire Nexus," he shouted again, pouring every ounce of magic he had into the spell. The runes flared gold once more, and this time they held. The green light faded, and the doorway in the shrine's center disappeared. Kai collapsed to the ground, his vision swimming. Soren crouched beside him, her expression unreadable. "You did it," she said quietly. Kai nodded weakly, his body trembling. For now, Emberling chirped softly, its flames flickering as it curled up beside him. Soren glanced at the shrine, her eyes narrowing. Alaric's not here, she said, but this isn't over. He's still out there. Kai took a shaky breath, his resolve hardening. Then we find him. Chapter 3, Corruption Unveiled. Part 4, The Weight of Consequences. The climb out of the Undercity was grueling. Every step felt heavier, every shadow in the narrow tunnels a potential threat. Emberling limped alongside Kai, its normally bright flames reduced to faint flickers. Soren led the way, her movements steady and deliberate. But even she couldn't hide the tension in her shoulders. The city above was no refuge. When they emerged into the arcane quarter, the corruption's spread was undeniable. The haze that clung to the air had thickened, swirling with streaks of green and black. The cobblestones beneath their feet were cracked and uneven, and strange marks, twisting, runes and jagged claw marks, marred the walls of nearby buildings. Kai's heart sank as he looked around. It's worse, Soren nodded grimly. We're running out of time. Stop standing there and focus. We don't have the luxury of sulking. Kai bristled but said nothing. He followed her inside, carefully setting Emberling down on a clear section of the counter. The fox chirped weakly, curling into a small ball as its flames flickered faintly. Kai reached into his satchel, pulling out Alaric's journal. The leather cover felt heavier than it should, the weight of the secrets inside pressing against him. Do you think there's anything in here about where Alaric went next? He asked, flipping through the pages. There has to be, Soren said, leaning against the counter and crossing her arms. Alaric doesn't do anything without a plan. If he left clues about the relic, it'll be in there. Kai nodded, scanning the entries with growing urgency. The pages were filled with intricate diagrams, magical equations, and cryptic notes about the Veil and its weakening state. But one entry stood out. The relic is the key, but it cannot be used alone. The cost must be paid in full, or the depths will take everything. Beneath the text was a symbol, a circle with jagged lines radiating outward, like a sun with broken rays. Kai frowned, tracing the symbol with his finger. I've seen this before. Where? Soren asked, her tone sharp. In the vault, Kai said. Alaric had a scroll with this exact symbol on it. Soren straightened, her expression serious. Do you still have it? No, Kai admitted. But if it's connected to the relic, Alaric must have taken it with him. Soren's eyes narrowed. Then we need to figure out where he's hiding. Fast. They made their way back to Mistvale Curiosities in silence, their footsteps echoing eerily in the empty streets. When they reached the shop, Kai hesitated in the doorway, staring at the wreckage inside. The shattered shelves, the broken wards, the lingering scorch marks, all of it was a stark reminder of his failure. Soren brushed past him, her tone sharp. Stop standing there and focus. We don't have the luxury of sulking. Kai bristled, but said nothing. He followed her inside, carefully setting Emberling down on a clear section of the counter. The fox chirped weakly, curling into a small ball as its flames flickered faintly. Kai reached into his satchel, pulling out Alaric's journal. The leather cover felt heavier than it should, the weight of the secrets inside pressing against him. Do you think there's anything in here about where Alaric went next? He asked, flipping through the pages. There has to be, Soren said, leaning against the counter and crossing her arms. Alaric doesn't do anything without a plan. If he left clues about the relic, it'll be in there. Kai nodded, scanning the entries with growing urgency. The pages were filled with intricate diagrams, magical equations, and cryptic notes about the Veil and its weakening state. But one entry stood out. The relic is the key, but it cannot be used alone. The cost must be paid in full, or the depths will take everything. Beneath the text was a symbol, a circle with jagged lines radiating outward, like a sun with broken rays. Kai frowned, tracing the symbol with his finger. I've seen this before. Where? Soren asked, her tone sharp. In the vault, Kai said. Alaric had a scroll with this exact symbol on it. Soren straightened, her expression serious. Do you still have it? No, Kai admitted. But if it's connected to the relic, Alaric must have taken it with him. Soren's eyes narrowed. Then we need to figure out where he's hiding. Fast. Kai's frustration grew as he flipped through the journal again, searching for anything that might hint at Alaric's whereabouts. The entries were dense, filled with vague references to ancient magic and half-finished theories. There's nothing here, he said, slamming the book shut. Don't lose focus, Soren said. Look again. Kai opened the journal reluctantly, his eyes scanning the pages for anything he might have missed. Then, near the back of the book, he found it, a series of coordinates, scrawled in the margins of an otherwise blank page. What's this? He muttered, tilting the journal so Soren could see. She leaned closer, her brow furrowing. Coordinates. Looks like they're for somewhere outside the city. Outside the city? Kai asked. What's out there? Not much, Soren said. Old ruins, forgotten shrines, wilderness. Kai's stomach churned. You think he's at another shrine? Maybe, Soren said. Or maybe he's hiding something even bigger. Before they could say more, the sound of shattering glass broke the tense silence. Kai spun around, his heart racing as he scanned the shop. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the floor, and the faint hum of corrupted magic filled the air. We've got company, Soren said, raising her crossbow. A figure emerged from the shadows, its body warped and twisted by the corruption. Its glowing eyes locked onto Kai, and it let out a guttural snarl as it lunged forward. Soren fired, the bolt striking the creature in the chest and forcing it back. But it didn't fall. More are coming, Soren warned, reloading her crossbow. Kai's hands trembled as he reached for his spellbook, Emberling stirring weakly beside him. The shop's wards were gone, leaving them exposed to whatever horrors the depths had sent after them. The sound of more glass breaking filled the air, followed by the heavy thud of something massive landing on the roof. Kai's blood ran cold. We're not going to last here, Soren said, her voice tight. We need to move. To where? Kai asked, panic creeping into his voice. The coordinates, Soren said. Whatever Alaric's hiding, it's our only chance. Kai hesitated, glancing at Emberling. The fox's flames flickered weakly, but it let out a soft chirp, as if encouraging him to move. He took a shaky breath, slipping the journal into his satchel. Let's go. Soren fired another bolt, covering their retreat as they bolted out of the shop and into the corrupted streets. The shadows followed, their guttural snarls, echoing through the air as Kai and Soren ran toward the city's edge. Chapter 3, Corruption Unveiled. Part 5, Escape into the Wild. The streets of the Arcane Quarter had become a maze of chaos, shadows twisted unnaturally, climbing up the walls of buildings and pooling in the cracked cobblestones. The air was thick with the sound of guttural snarls and the heavy thud of unseen creatures. Moving through the haze, Kai ran behind Soren, his legs burning and his heart pounding in his chest. Emberling struggled to keep pace, its normally fluid, fiery movements reduced to a faint limp. Stay close, Soren called over her shoulder, her crossbow ready in her hands. I'm trying! Kai shouted back, clutching the strap of his satchel. The corruption had spread faster than either of them had anticipated. Tendrils of black ichor seeped from the cracks in the streets, reaching for them like living things. Soren fired a bolt at one that came too close, the glowing projectile burning it away before it could grab Kai's ankle. We can't outrun them forever, Kai shouted, glancing back at the writhing mass of shadows that followed. We don't have to, Soren replied. The edge of the city's close. Once we're out of this damned quarter, we'll lose them in the wilds. Kai's stomach churned at the thought of heading into the untamed wilderness outside Mistveil's walls. But there was no time to argue. The snarls behind them grew louder, closer, as the pack of corrupted creatures pursued them relentlessly. They turned a corner, and Soren skidded to a halt. A group of creatures blocked the street ahead, their bodies twisted and warped. Some were barely recognizable as human, while others resembled animals, their forms corrupted beyond reason. Soren cursed under her breath. We're surrounded. Kai's panic surged. What do we do? Soren didn't answer. She raised her crossbow, firing rapidly as the creatures charged. Her bolts hit their marks. But for every corrupted figure that fell, 2 more seemed to take its place. Kai fumbled for his spellbook, his hands trembling as he flipped through the pages. He found a defensive spell, a barrier, but his mind raced with doubt. Would it be strong enough to hold? He didn't have time to think. He raised his hands, shouting the incantation. Aegis Lumen! A shimmering dome of golden light erupted around them, forcing the creatures back with a screech. The corrupted figures clawed at the barrier, their hands leaving dark smears of ichor against the glowing surface. Kai gritted his teeth, pouring more energy into the spell as cracks began to spread across the dome. This won't hold for long. Just keep it up, Soren shouted, reloading her crossbow. Emberling let out a weak chirp, its flickering body pressing against Kai's leg. The cracks in the barrier widened, and the dome shuddered violently. Kai's strength was waning, his magic draining faster than he'd anticipated. Soren, he shouted, desperation in his voice. Soren fired another bolt, taking out one of the larger creatures clawing at the barrier. We're out of time, she said through gritted teeth. The dome shattered with a deafening crack, the force of the collapse sending Kai sprawling to the ground. The creatures surged forward, their glowing eyes fixed on him. Before they could reach him, Soren hurled a glowing orb into the center of the pack. The explosion of light and fire sent the creatures scattering, their screeches echoing through the street. Move! She shouted, grabbing Kai's arm and pulling him to his feet. Kai stumbled forward, his legs barely supporting him as they broke into a sprint. The edge of the city was close now, the towering stone walls of Mistvale looming ahead. Beyond them lay the wilds, vast, untamed, and dangerous in their own right. The corrupted creatures regrouped quickly, their guttural snarls growing louder as they closed in. "There's the gate!" Soren shouted, pointing to a massive iron gate built into the wall. Kai's chest burned as he pushed himself to keep running, his vision swimming from exhaustion. The gate loomed closer, its heavy chains glinting faintly in the haze. "How do we get through?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Leave that to me," Soren said, pulling a small rune-etched device from her belt. She slammed it against the gate's lock, and the runes flared brightly before the chains fell away with a metallic clatter. The gate creaked open just enough for them to slip through. Soren shoved Kai forward. "Go!" He stumbled into the wilds beyond, the thick forest swallowing him in its shadowy embrace. The sounds of pursuit faded as the gate slammed shut behind them. Kai collapsed onto the forest floor, gasping for air as Emberling curled up beside him. Soren leaned against a nearby tree, her chest heaving as she reloaded her crossbow. "We made it," Kai said weakly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Barely," Soren replied, her tone grim. She scanned the dark forest, her sharp eyes watching for any signs of movement. Kai sat up slowly, his exhaustion giving way to a deep, gnawing unease. The wilds were eerily silent, the dense trees and undergrowth casting long shadows that seemed to shift and stretch unnaturally. "Now what?" he asked, his voice trembling. Soren pulled out a small map, her expression tense. "The coordinates from Alaric's journal point to a spot about a day's travel from here. If we keep moving, we can reach it by nightfall tomorrow." Kai's heart sank at the thought of spending another night running, but he nodded. "Okay, let's go." Soren glanced at him, her expression softening slightly. "Get some rest first. You're no good to me if you pass out halfway there." Kai hesitated, glancing at Emberling. The fox's flames flickered faintly, but it chirped softly, curling tighter against his side. "All right," Kai said quietly, leaning back against a tree. His body ached, and his mind was a storm of conflicting thoughts, but exhaustion soon overtook him. As he drifted into a restless sleep, the whispers returned, faint and insidious. "Kai." The voice was soft, familiar, and filled with quiet malice. "You can't run forever.